Thank you very much. I wanted to say thank you to Priya for sticking to the time, and that there will be opportunity for more intervention, and there'll be questions coming your way as well later on, and to other panelists as well. We will have enough time. I would like to now turn to Professor Arjan Haan. I hope I pronounce it correctly. Dr. Haan is a development expert focusing on public policy and poverty. And he leads the IDRC, International Development Research Center program in Canada on supporting inclusive growth, based out of Ottawa, I believe. He has worked before in the Institute for Social Studies at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, where he also has a PhD from. So over to you, Dr. De Haan.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Dilip. It's great to meet. What wasn't clear on my CV is that I believe I worked on migration in Sussex before both you and Priya came there. So it almost feels like a reunion. In any case, it's so great, and I'm so grateful for Arjan particularly inviting me for this important discussion. As a researcher of migration, I cannot agree more with the conclusion of the policy notes, including that migrants have been excluded from most benefits in cities, including access to social security programs, with many living in slums. And in fact, I think Priya is hinting at that too. I would extend that same conclusion to all internal migrants, and I'd say there's an inherent contradiction between the contribution all migrants make to India's economy and the lack of recognition and support. The COVID pandemic, as I think all of us here witnessed, showed this contradiction and its underlying inequalities in very stark and tragic manners. Not only were the needs and rights of migrant workers seemingly invisible in the measures to contain the pandemic, but arguably the neglect even enhanced the public health risks, as millions were forced to make the long journey home without being able to take the necessary distancing measures. So I fully endorse the recommendations made in the policy note on the need for provisions to include migrant workers. There are no legal barriers to that either. In health, in education, social protection, financial inclusion, all these are important. And I would emphasize the need to also, I think Priya hinted at that, to take a gender perspective in this, as women migrate in large number, maybe larger numbers, but they always move as migrant workers. And they are often the most vulnerable in context of migrations, and policies need to be designed with a gender perspective. Identification program, there is indeed an opportunity. I agree with the notes that it's an opportunity to promote access and inclusion for all. But as the policy note rightly highlights, it's not a panacea and does not resolve all questions of access. Priya, the point you made about intermediaries is actually quite an important point in that. You're absolutely right. As we saw during the crisis, government policies failed migrant workers, and civil society organizations had to step in inevitably with limited means. I'd like to add perhaps to my colleagues in this panel, my colleagues' comments is from the perspective of an historian, which is where my training is in. The COVID policy response and the impact this had on migrants reminded me that similar movements of migrant workers have not been uncommon in India. In fact, at every crisis you see movements like this, and my own study brought this particularly back to the crisis in 1929 and similar movements of workers out of industrial areas. 1931, the pandemic in Mumbai similarly has in the past has seen those movements. So importantly, those movements, and this was not an exception, this was a common movement. Return to villages have been and are a regular phenomenon. And happens annually, but especially in crisis. And much, or if not most, of migration has been circular, meaning that migrants have remained closely tied to their villages of origin and never got a full foothold in the cities. This was the case in the colonial industries in the 19th century, as much as it is for workers in the urban informal sector in the beginning of the 21st century. And in itself, the circularity may not be a bad thing. I think, Dilip, very importantly, migration is part of development, that circularity is part of development, but it has been associated with migrants being second-rate citizens in cities, areas of origin, and in fact in their own country, despite the legal rights. And this is probably not the case for all migrant laborers. I would emphasize that as skilled workers in large enterprises do actually get most of those rights and services. And what we witness is a compounding of disadvantages of migrant workers, unskilled occupations, often lower caste, as I said, particularly women, that are most disadvantaged and excluded. For employers as well as policymakers, migrant workers have been by and large dispensable. That may be a strong term, maybe somewhat of an exaggeration, but the mere fact that we lack good statistics on migrants has indicated a deep lack of concern, and this is for a very long period of time, and I don't think it's tied to particular political parties. This is an historical phenomenon. The long history of marginalization, I don't think is an argument for despair. There are many cases around the world in which discriminatory policies have been reversed. And the impact that the lack of access is likely to have had on public health right now, in terms of likely having contributed to the spread of infection, must provide a clear reason to reverse that marginalization. There's a self-interest in reversing that marginalization. However, what my reading of labor history suggests is that the marginalization is unlikely to be reversed by simple and technical fixes, and we commented on that already. The marginalization is deep-rooted and will need concerted efforts to change, to obtain better information about migrants, having data, right, and absolutely agree, is very important, to reform the policies as the policy notes suggest, and also the mobilization by migrant workers to claim their rights. Transformative change likely will need for these different factors to come together, and I very much hope that the current context may help galvanize that change, and that's where the work of this group should come in and is so important. Thanks very much, everybody.